Hello and welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Tom Connell. We've just had week one of the new Senate and one gets the sense the government is taking a deep breath. When the parliamentary schedule was devised by the government, they penciled in a Senate-only sitting week for the second week in July because they thought it would be a chance to repeal the carbon and mining taxes. As we now know, that didn't happen. What was supposed to be a simple piece of legislation when it comes to repealing the carbon tax became a negotiation nightmare. Clive Palmer making it clear his main aim in this parliament, at least for now, appears to be to frustrate the Abbott government. We will be hearing from Labor Senator and Parliamentary Secretary to the Environment, or Shadow Parliamentary Secretary I should say, Lisa Singh, later on in the program. But first to Perth, where the Finance Minister Mathias Cormann has been good enough to join us. Mathias Cormann, thank you very much for your time today.
Good to be here.
I'd just like to get your thoughts first of all. It's been an interesting week, it's fair to say, in the Senate, in that first week of the new Senate. What have you made of it all?
It was obviously an important week for a range of people that are now new to the Senate. We are disappointed that the Senate failed to take the opportunity to help families and small business by scrapping the carbon tax, but we are absolutely determined to persist until the carbon tax is gone, because that was the commitment we made in the lead up to the last election, because that is the right thing to do for families and for business and for the economy as a whole.
Can you clarify for everybody out there, including business, Clive Palmer, there was some talk that this 250% penalty for not passing on the cost of the repeal of the carbon tax might apply to all entities. Now, if that is presented by the Palmer United Party next week, if he changes his mind again and said it should apply to all businesses, every single business that have paid electricity essentially, would the government consider that, or would they rule out having that as a penalty?
Well, we let the Palmer United Party talk for themselves in terms of their amendments. What we are focused on, and what we have always been focused on, is that the scrapping of the carbon tax, which leads to reductions in the cost of generating electricity, those cost reductions should be passed on to consumers and to business. Now, we have sought to achieve that by giving additional resources to the ICCC, and of course electricity price regulators around the country have already come out to say that those cost reductions would be passed on. A number of the private generators have come out to say that they would pass those cost reductions on. From our point of view,
just very specifically, though, business is concerned that perhaps this 250% penalty could possibly apply to all businesses, all entities. Can you rule that out right now?
Well, again, I let the Palmer United Party talk for themselves. They've made very clear that they only seek to apply that to electricity and gas generators. From our point of view, as I've just said to you, we've always been committed to ensuring that cost reductions in terms of the cost of generating energy as a result of scrapping the carbon tax are properly passed through to consumers and to business. And of course, we've said all the way through that we were prepared to support amendments put forward by the Palmer United Party to put that even further beyond doubt. Now, I understand that the Palmer United Party is getting some further advice in terms of making sure that the construct of their amendment is consistent with all of the relevant requirements, including, of course, the important requirement to be consistent with our Constitution. And we look forward to concluding this debate, hopefully sometime next week.
Okay, you've spoken about letting Clive Palmer speak for himself, but what have you made of him so far, his role in this first week in the Senate? Would you agree his policy positions seem somewhat erratic?
No, I don't agree with that. What I would say, though, is that 25 Labor senators who went to the last election asserting that they had already removed the carbon tax, again voted to keep it. 25 Labor senators and 10 Green senators voted for higher electricity prices, higher gas prices, and of course higher cost of living expenses for families and pensioners across Australia. And that is, again, entirely inconsistent with what they, certainly the Labor Party, made people believe they would do in the lead up to the last election.
Right, but on this issue of Clive Palmer, for example, the government appears set to be at the moment in a mode of mollifying him. not biting back, for example, at various verbal insults that he's thrown at Tony Abbott, and he and his senators have thrown at Tony Abbott. And also, for example, this issue of CITIC taking legal action against him over a $12 million dispute. We haven't heard anyone come out from the government and say, well, Clive Palmer's got questions to answer. Nothing at all. Is he off limits at the moment? Is it a case of treating Clive nicely?
Well, there's a series of different and unconnected issues that you're raising there. Firstly, I mean, to the extent that there are legal proceedings, it would be entirely inappropriate for anyone from government to give a running commentary on what are proceedings that are appropriately taking place through the usual and appropriate processes. But when it comes to what happened on the floor of the Senate, I mean, I'm very mindful. I mean, I've been in the Senate now for 7 years. I well remember the first day I arrived in the Senate. When you get into any new work environment like that, it does take a while to properly settle into everything. And you know, I've got to say, I felt for all of those new crossbench senators who, right in the first week, were confronted, obviously, with a pretty robust and significant debate. And I'm not, look, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure that all of these things will settle down over time as everybody gets to know each other better, and as everybody settles into the routine of the Senate.
Do you have permission from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office to talk freely with crossbenchers to try to convince them yourself, mount a personal case for the government's agenda? Do you have that permission? You're allowed to go out there?
Well, it's not a matter of having permission. I mean, it's a matter of, it's my job to ensure that in the areas that are my areas of portfolio and policy responsibility, it's obviously expected of me that I do everything I can to help to ensure that the government's policy agenda, that the commitments we took to the last election are effectively implemented.
We heard when Labor was in power, of course, many times from the coalition that it was a dysfunctional minority government. What would you expect, in light of that, voters to make of the first week of the Senate?
Well, I mean, this is a new Senate. We've got a large number of new crossbench senators. I don't think that there's anything surprising in the proposition that the new Senate is still finding its feet. And, I'm pretty confident that, as has happened in the past, that these issues will be worked through, over a period of time. And when there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, governments have very rarely had the majority in the Senate, and governments have historically always had to work their way through difficult majorities against them in the Senate, and we will do this, and we will in an orderly, methodical fashion continue to put our policy agenda to the Senate, make our case, and hopefully persuade them of the merits of what we're doing.
Do you think the last week was orderly and methodical?
Well, it was the first week of a new Senate, and obviously we're disappointed that the Senate failed to take the opportunity to reduce cost of living expenses for families, to reduce the cost of doing business in Australia by scrapping the carbon tax. But we'll stick with it. We are going to reintroduce the carbon tax repeal legislation in the House of Representatives on Monday, and the Senate will have another opportunity.
This mantra of orderly and methodical, right now, it's not working out, is it? So when you look over the next 6 or 12 months, and comments from Tony Abbott yesterday, well, perhaps after 6 or 12 months, then we look at it. That was his response to whether or not he would push for another election. Is that a realistic time frame, considering you've got issues, well, more than $40 billion of savings at the moment blocked by various parties?
The problem that we have is that the Labor Party is still in a complete state of denial. They're in a state of denial about the state of the budget they left behind. They are right now opposing nearly $40 billion in savings measures. We will continue to make the case as to why it is important to deliver the budget measures that we brought down just under 2 months ago. Let's see what happens over time. I mean, we've only just started. We've only just started putting budget measure after budget measure to the Senate. I mean, the first two significant budget bills that were put to the Senate, despite despite contradictory indications initially, were actually both passed by the Senate, with Labor quietly voting in favour of the temporary budget repair levy after initially having indicated that they'd oppose it. I mean, we call on Bill Shorten and the Labor Party to finally face up to the debt and deficit disaster they left behind and to start becoming part of the solution.
Is that a realistic call, though, given, well, arguably the coalition put the no in opposition when you had your time? Are you really expecting Labor to come to the party?
Well, we stood up against a tax that was bad for the economy, bad for families, bad for pensioners, bad for jobs, bad for investment, and of course the Australian people supported the judgment that we've made. But like the proposition that Labor is putting to us at the moment is that they want us to continue to borrow from our children and grandchildren in order to fund our living standards today. Now, that is not sustainable. I mean, it means that we would be reducing opportunity for our children and grandchildren instead of protecting living standards and building opportunity for the future. Now, over time, I can't believe that the Labor Party would continue to persist with a proposition that would weaken our country into the future.
What about the amendments to the carbon tax, just to return to that for a moment, these amendments that Clive Palmer has proposed? How does that fit in with the government's mantra of reducing red tape?
Well, scrapping the carbon tax massively reduces red tape. And of course, I mean, we are always focused on making sure that we achieve our objective in the most efficient way possible. And that is our objective here too. But I mean, you've got to understand, I mean, the carbon tax that Labor and the Greens put in place imposed extraordinary levels of red tape, extraordinary levels of compliance burdens, extraordinary levels of additional costs to business across Australia, and we are getting rid of all of that.
Just on the replacement, your direct action plan, have you had any discussions with the crossbench, or for that matter, any members of the Senate on the likelihood of that passing? Is that still looking pretty unlikely that it's going to get that support?
Well, the legislation that is before the Parliament at the moment, and which we will be, well, which was before the Senate last week, which we're introducing into the House of Representatives on Monday, is the carbon tax repeal bill. The implementation of our emissions reduction fund will obviously be one of the next pieces of legislation that we'll be dealing with, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
But you're already there, you're already negotiating. Do you have any indications from any of the crossbench senators, many of whom have said they are unlikely to support this? How is that bridge building going?
Well, no, right now we're focused on passage of the legislation to scrap the carbon tax so we can bring down the cost of living and so we can bring down the cost of doing business in Australia. The implementation of the emissions reduction fund will be the subject of a separate piece of legislation which will be dealt with after we have repealed the carbon tax, after we've dealt with the mining tax repeal legislation and various other high priority commitments that we took to the last election.
A battle for another day, perhaps. I just want to finish on the visit of Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister. It attracted a lot of criticism by the Chinese state media, not just of Japan, but also of Tony Abbott and his praising of the Japanese soldiers, saying they acted with a sense of honour. Chinese state media said that was appalling. What was your take on that?
Well, I thought the Prime Minister gave a very good speech. Clearly, I mean, it was a very important visit to Australia by Prime Minister Abe. Clearly, the relationship, the personal relationship between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Abbott is very good. That is good for Australia. It helps, of course, in continuing to strengthen the very important relationship that we have. We have an important relationship and an important friendship with Japan, but of course we also have an important relationship and a very important friendship with China, and we will seek to continue to build.
Just to bring you specifically to those comments, Tony Abbott said about Japanese soldiers, we admired the skill and sense of honour that they brought to their task, although we disagreed with what they did. Now, he was talking about World War II, a time when Japanese soldiers carried out, going into some of the gruesome details, mass execution of prisoners of war, of civilians, Chinese civilians in particular, in some areas in Singapore as well. This is a sensitive area for Australia and China. Was it a mistake to talk about a sense of honour of Japanese soldiers by Tony Abbott?
No, I don't believe it was. I mean, you got to remember, like Australia and Japan were on opposite sides, in the Second World War. So, I mean, the comments made by Prime Minister Abbott weren't directed against anyone. They were essentially part of, moving forward into a stronger period, reflecting on some of the experiences of the past. And I mean, look, we have a very important relationship with Japan. We have a very important relationship with China. One relationship doesn't exclude the opportunity for a strong relationship with the other, and we are focused on continuing to strengthen our friendship and our trade relationship in particular with both those very important partners in our region.
Okay, Mathias Cormann, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you for your time today on Saturday Agenda.
Always good to be here.
Stay